Okay, we're going to continue today. If I'm going to try and make it easier to download so that you can listen to it, and it won't take forever. Chapter 5, Troubles with a Penguin. The next day was quite eventful at 432 Proudfoot Avenue. First there was the serviceman, and then the policeman, and then the trouble about the license. Captain Cook was in the children's room watching Janny and Bill put together a jigsaw puzzle on the floor. He was very good about not disturbing the pieces after Bill had spanked him for eating one. He did not hear the refrigerator serviceman come to the back door. Mrs. Popper had gone marketing for canned shrimps for the Penguin, so that Mr. Popper was alone in the kitchen to explain to the serviceman what he wanted done to the refrigerator. The serviceman put his tool bag down on the kitchen floor, looked at the refrigerator, and then at Mr. Popper, who, to tell the truth, had not shaved yet and was not very tidy. "Mister," he said, "you don't need no ventilating holes in that there door." "It's my icebox, and I want some holes bored in the door," said Mr. Popper. They argued about it for quite a while. Mr. Popper knew that to get the serviceman to do what he wanted, all he had to do was to explain that he was going to keep a live penguin in the icebox and that he wanted his pet to have plenty of fresh air, even though the door was closed all night. He felt a little stubborn about explaining, however. He didn't want to discuss Captain Cook with this unsympathetic serviceman who was already staring at Mr. Popper as if he thought Mr. Popper was not quite right in the head. "Come on, do what I said," said Mr. Popper. "I'm paying you for it." "With what?" asked the serviceman. Mr. Popper gave him a $5 bill. It made him a little sad to think how many beans it would have bought for Mrs. Popper and the children. The serviceman examined the bill carefully as if he didn't trust Mr. Popper too much, but at last he put it in his pocket, took a drill from his tool bag, and made 5 small holes in a neat pattern on the refrigerator door. "Now," said Mr. Popper, "don't get up. Wait a minute, there is one more thing." "Now what?" said the serviceman. "I suppose now you want me to take the door off its hinges to let in a little more air, or do you want me to make a radio set out of your icebox?" "Don't get funny," said Mr. Popper indignantly. "That is no way to talk. Believe it or not, I know what I'm doing. I mean, having you do. I want you to fix an extra handle on the inside of that box so it can be opened from the inside of the box." "That," said the serviceman, "is a fine idea. You want an extra handle on the inside. Sure. He picked up his tool bag. "Aren't you going to do it for me?" asked Mr. Popper. "Oh, sure," said the serviceman, edging toward the back door. Mr. Popper saw that for all his words of agreement, the serviceman had no intention of putting on an inside handle. "I thought you were a serviceman," he said. "I am. That's the first sensible thing you've said yet. You're a fine kind of serviceman if you don't even know how to put an extra handle on the inside of an icebox door." "Oh, I don't I? Don't think I don't know how. As far as that goes, I've even got a spare handle in my tool bag and plenty of screws. You needn't think I don't know how to do it if I wanted to." Mr. Popper silently reached into his pocket and gave the serviceman his last $5 bill. He was pretty sure that Mrs. Popper would be annoyed at him for spending all that money, but it could not be helped. "Mister," said the serviceman, "you win. I'll fix your extra handle, and while I am doing it, you sit down on that chair over there facing me where I can keep an eye on you." "Fair enough," said Mr. Popper, sitting down. The serviceman was still on the floor, putting in the final screws that held the new handle in place when the penguin came out to the kitchen on his silent pink feet. Surprised at seeing a strange man sitting on the floor, Captain Cook quietly walked over and began to peck him curiously, but the serviceman was even more surprised than Captain Cook. "Or," said the penguin, "or perhaps it was the serviceman." Mr. Popper was not sure just what had happened when he picked up himself in his chair a moment later. There had been a shower of flying tools, a violent slamming of the door, and the serviceman was gone. These sudden noises, of course, brought the children running. Mr. Popper showed them how the refrigerator was now all remodeled for the penguin. He showed Captain Cook, too, by shutting him inside it. The penguin at once noticed the shiny new inside handle and bit it with his usual curiosity. The door opened, and Captain Cook jumped out. Mr. Popper promptly put Captain Cook back inside and shut the door again, to be sure that the penguin learned his lesson. Before long, Captain Cook became quite skillful at getting out and was ready to be taught how to get inside when the door was shut. By the time the policeman came to the back door, Captain Cook was going in and out of the refrigerator as easily as if he had lived in one all of his life. Chapter 6, More Troubles. The children were the first to notice the policeman. "Look, Papa," said Bill, "there's a policeman at the back door. Is he going to arrest you?" "Gook," said Captain Cook, walking with dignity to the door and trying to poke his beak through the screen. "Is this 432 Proudfoot Avenue?" "It is," answered Mr. Popper. "Well, I guess this is the place, all right," said the policeman and pointed to Captain Cook. "Is that thing yours?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Popper proudly. "And what do you do for a living?" asked the policeman sternly. "Papa is an artist," said Janny. "He's always getting paint and calcimine all over his clothes," said Bill. "I'm a house painter, a decorator," said Mr. Popper. "Won't you come in?" "I won't," said the policeman, "unless I have to." "Ha ha," said Bill, "the policeman is afraid of Captain Cook." "Gah," said the penguin, opening his red beak wide as if he wanted to laugh at the policeman. "Can it talk?" asked the policeman. "What is it, a giant parrot?" "It's a penguin," said Janny. "We keep it for a pet." "Well, if it's only a bird," said the policeman, lifting his cap to scratch his head in a puzzled sort of way. "From the way that fellow with the tool bag yelled at me outside, I thought there was a lion loose in here." "Mama says Papa's hair looks like a lion sometimes," said Bill. "Keep still, Bill," said Janny. "The policeman doesn't care how Papa's hair looks." The policeman now scratched his chin. "If it's only a bird, I suppose it will be okay if you keep him in a cage." "We keep him in the icebox," said Bill. "You can put it in the icebox for all I care," said the policeman. "What kind of a bird did you say it was?" "A penguin," answered Mr. Popper, "and by the way, I might want to take him walking with me. Would it be all right if I kept him on a leash?" "I tell you," said the policeman, "honestly, I don't know what the municipal ordinance about penguins is, with or without a leash on the public streets. I'll ask my sergeant." "Maybe I ought to get a license for him," suggested Mr. Popper. "It's certainly big enough for a license," said the policeman. "I tell you what to do. You call up the city hall and ask them what the ruling about penguins is. And good luck to you, Popper. He's kind of a cute little fellow at that. Looks almost human. Good day to you, Popper, and good day to you, Mr. Penguin." When Mr. Popper telephoned the city hall to see about a license for Captain Cook, the penguin did his best to disconnect the telephone by biting the green cord. Perhaps he thought it was some new kind of eel. But just then, Mrs. Popper came back from the market and opened a can of shrimp, so that Mr. Popper was soon left alone at the telephone. Even so, he found it was not so easy to learn whether or not he must get a license for his strange pet. Every time he would explain what he wanted, he would be told to wait a minute, and much later a new voice would ask him what he wanted. This went on for a considerable time. At last, a new voice seemed to take a little interest in the case. Pleased with this friendly voice, Mr. Popper began again to tell about Captain Cook. "Is he an army captain, a police captain, or a navy captain?" "He is not," said Mr. Popper. "He's a penguin." "Will you repeat that, please?" said the voice. Mr. Popper repeated it. The voice suggested that perhaps he had better spell it. "Penguin," said Mr. Popper. "Penguin." "Oh," said the voice, "you mean that Captain Cook's first name is Benjamin?" "Not Benjamin, Penguin. It's a bird," said Mr. Popper. "Do you mean," said the voice in his ear, "that Captain Cook wishes a license to shoot birds? I am sorry, the bird hunting season does not open until November. And please try to speak a little more distinctly. Mr. Topper, did you say your name is?" "My name is Popper, not Topper," shouted Mr. Popper. "Yes, Mr. Potter, now I hear you quite clearly." "Then listen," roared Mr. Potter, now completely outraged. "If you folks at the city hall don't even know what penguins are, I guess you haven't any rules saying that they have to be licensed. I will do without a license for Captain Cook." "Just a minute, Mr. Popwell. Our own Mr. Treadbottom of the Bureau of Navigation of Lakes, Rivers, Ponds, and Streams has just come in. I will let you speak to him personally. Perhaps he knows this Benjamin Cook of yours." In a moment, a new voice was speaking to Mr. Popper. "Good morning. This is the Automobile License Bureau. Did you have this same card last year? And if so, what was the license number?" Mr. Popper had been switched over to the county building. He decided to hang up. Chapter 7, Captain Cook Builds a Nest. Very reluctantly, Janny and Bill had to leave Captain Cook and go to school. Mrs. Popper was busy in the kitchen, rather belatedly doing the breakfast dishes, and while she dimly realized that the penguin was going in and out of the refrigerator pretty frequently, she thought nothing of it at first. Meanwhile, Mr. Popper had abandoned his telephoning and was now busy shaving and making himself neat in honor of being the owner of such a splendid bird as Captain Cook. But the penguin, though thus neglected for the moment, was by no means idle. With the unusual excitement and having to go to the market earlier than usual, Mrs. Popper had not yet got around to straightening the house. She was an excellent housekeeper. Still, with two children like Janny and Bill and a husband with such untidy ways, there is no denying the fact that she had to pick up the place rather frequently. Captain Cook was now attending to the picking up. Into the corners of every room he prowled and poked and pecked with a busy thoroughness. Into every closet he stared with his white, circled eyes. Under and behind all the furniture he crowded his plump figure with little subdued cries of curiosity, surprise, and pleasure. And each time he found what he seemed to be looking for, he picked it up in the black end of his red beak and carried it, waddling proudly on his wide, pink feet, into the kitchen and into the icebox. At last it occurred to Mrs. Popper to wonder what on earth the busy bird was up to. When she looked, she could only scream to Mr. Popper to come quickly and see what Captain Cook had done now. Mr. Popper, himself looking rather remarkable, as Mrs. Popper noticed later, joined her in staring with astonishment into the refrigerator. Captain Cook came up too and helped them look. "Ork, ork," he said with triumph. Mrs. Popper laughed, and Mr. Popper gasped as they saw the results of Captain Cook's trips through the house. 2 spools of thread, one white chess bishop, and 6 parts of a jigsaw puzzle, a teaspoon and a closed box of safety matches, a radish, 2 pennies, a nickel, and a golf ball, 2 pencil stubs, 1 bent playing card, and a small ashtray, 5 hairpins, an olive, 2 dominoes, and a sock, a nail file, 4 buttons of various sizes, a telephone slug, 7 marbles, and a tiny doll's chair, 5 checker pieces, a bit of graham cracker, a Parcheesi cup, and an eraser, a door key, a button hook, and a crumpled piece of tin foil, half of a very old lemon, the head of a china doll, Mr. Popper's pipe, and a ginger ale cap, an ink bottle cork, 2 screws, and a belt buckle, 6 heads from a child's necklace, 5 building blocks, a darning egg, a bone, a small harmonica, and a partly consumed lollipop, 2 toothpaste lids, and a small red notebook. I guess this is what you call the rookery, said Mr. Popper, only he couldn't find any stones to build his nest with. Well, said Mrs. Popper, those penguins may have heathen ways at the South Pole, but I declare I think this one is going to be quite a help around the house. Ork, said Captain Cook, and strutting into the living room, he knocked over the best lamp. I think, Papa, said Mr. Popper, that you had better take Captain Cook outside for a little exercise. Goodness gracious, but you're all dressed up. Why, you look almost like a penguin yourself. Mr. Popper had smoothed down his hair and shaved off his whiskers. Never again would Mrs. Popper have to reproach him for looking as wild as a lion. He had put on a white shirt with a white tie and white flannel trousers and a pair of bright tan oxblood shoes. He had got out of the cedar chest his old black evening tailcoat that he had been married in, and brushed it carefully and put it on too. He did indeed look a little like a penguin. He turned and strutted like one now for Mrs. Popper, but he did not forget his duty to Captain Cook. Can I have a few yards of clothesline, please, Mama? Asked Mr. Popper. Chapter 8. Penguin's Promenade. Mr. Popper soon found that it was not so easy to take a penguin for a stroll. Captain Cook did not care at first for the idea of being put on a leash. However, Mr. Popper was firm. He tied one end of the clothesline to the penguin's fat throat and the other to his own wrist. Ork, said Captain Cook indignantly. Still, he was a very reasonable sort of bird, and when he saw that protesting did him no good, he recovered his customary dignity and decided to let Mr. Popper lead him. Mr. Popper put on his best Sunday derby and opened the front door with Captain Cook waddling graciously beside him. "Gah," said the penguin, stepping at the edge of the porch to look down at the steps. Mr. Popper gave him plenty of clothesline leash. "Gook," said Captain Cook, and raising his flippers, he leaned forward bravely and tobogganed down the steps on his stomach. Mr. Popper followed, though not in the same way. Captain Cook quickly got up on his feet again and strutted to the street ahead of Mr. Popper with many quick turns of his head and pleased comments on the new scene. Down Proudfoot Avenue came a neighbor of the Poppers, Mrs. Callahan, with her arms full of groceries. She stared in astonishment when she saw Captain Cook and Mr. Popper looking like a larger penguin himself in his black tailcoat. "Heavens have mercy on us," she exclaimed as the bird began to investigate the striped stockings under her house dress. "It isn't an owl, and it isn't a goose." "It isn't," said Mr. Popper, tipping his Sunday derby. "It's an Antarctic penguin, Mrs. Callahan." "Get away from me," said Mrs. Callahan to Captain Cook. "An anteater, is it?" "Not anteater," explained Mr. Popper. "Antarctic. It was sent to me from the South Pole." "Take your South Pole goose away from me at once," said Mrs. Callahan. Mr. Popper pulled obediently at the clothesline while Captain Cook took a parting peck at Mrs. Callahan's striped stockings. "Heaven preserve us," said Mrs. Callahan. "I must stop in and see Mrs. Popper at once. I would never have believed it. I will be going now." "So will I," said Mr. Popper as Captain Cook dragged him off down the street. Their next stop was at the drugstore at the corner of Proudfoot Avenue and Main Street. Here Captain Cook insisted on looking over the window display, which consisted of several open packages of shiny white Bort crystals. These he evidently mistook for polar snow, which he began to peck at the window vigorously. Suddenly a car wheeled to the nearby curb with a streak of its brakes, and 2 young men sprang out, one of them bearing a camera. "This must be it," said the first young man to the other. "It's them, all right," said the second young man. The cameraman set up his tripod on the sidewalk. By this time a small crowd had gathered around, and 2 men in white coats had even come out of the drugstore to watch. Captain Cook, however, was still too much interested in the window exhibits to bother to turn around. "You are Mr. Popper of 432 Proudfoot Avenue, aren't you?" asked the second young man, pulling a notebook out of his pocket. "Yes," said Mr. Popper, realizing that his picture was about to be taken for the newspaper. The 2 young men had, as a matter of fact, heard about the strange bird from the policeman and had been on their way to the Popper house to get an interview when they saw Captain Cook. "Hey, Pelican, turn around and see the pretty birdie," said the photographer. "That's no pelican," said the other, who was a reporter. "Pelicans have a pouch in their bills." "I'd think it was a dodo, only dodos are extinct. This will make an elegant picture if I can ever get her to turn around." "It's a penguin," said Mr. Popper proudly. "Its name is Captain Cook." "Gook," said said the penguin, turning around now that they were talking about him. Spying the camera tripod, he walked over and examined it. Probably thinks it's a three-legged stork, said the photographer. This bird of yours, said the reporter, is it a he or a she? The public will want to know. Mr. Popper hesitated. Well, I call it Captain Cook. That makes it a he, said the reporter, writing rapidly in his notebook. Still curious, Captain Cook started walking round and round the tripod till the clothesline, the penguin, Mr. Popper, and the tripod were all tangled up. At the advice of one of the bystanders, the tangle was finally straightened out by Mr. Popper's walking around the tripod 3 times in the opposite direction. At last, Captain Cook, standing still beside Mr. Popper, consented to pose. Mr. Popper straightened his tie, and the cameraman snapped the picture. Captain Cook shut his eyes, and this is the way his picture appeared later in all the newspapers. One last question, said the reporter. Where did you get your strange pet? From Admiral Drake, the South Pole explorer. He sent him to me for a present. Yeah, said the reporter. Anyway, it's a good story. The 2 young men jumped into their car. Mr. Popper and Captain Cook continued their walk with quite a crowd following and asking questions. The crowd was getting so thick that in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into a barber shop. The man who kept the barber shop had, up to this time, been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. All right, we'll stop there.